Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 11. I'm looking forward to reading everyone's papers. If that is submitted, you've just completed the second of three major milestones. And in the next few weeks, we're going to start turning our attention towards that final presentation. To that end, this is going to be another two-part presentation for the week. It's the last two-parter, I promise. But I want to give you those examples of previous presentations that were successful and walk you through some of the information that's there. In the meantime, we still have a few more readings to go along with the coming assignments as we turn our attention towards that final. And I want to talk about the readings that are due today. Together, they address the bigger picture. They address some of their own themes, but they also address the bigger picture of modernism and postmodernism. Now, the question of, is there a sort of real societal break when something called postmodernism comes along is a big one. And I'm not quite prepared to fully answer that for you right now. That's why I've called this modernism good and bad. It sort of looks at the good parts of modernism and some of the bad parts. We could also call it something like modernism for better or worse. I don't know, but this is the idea. To begin with, we should define modernism. You hear about modern art. You might talk about how certain things are very modern looking, but we should really recognize that this is a conception regarding society. It's a view towards a certain kind of cultural and social order. And it's an understanding of ways in which society changed over time. And by some accounts, we have left the modern era and we're in something like the contemporary era or something like that. Various different names tend to float around. So when we look at modernism, and if we talk about modernism with a capital M, what are we really talking about? Well, there's a real fundamental change in the way people live and work that occurs in the middle of the 19th century. And that occurs when production processes, when the economy had grown to a point in which there are these large factories, and there's many different technologies that made these factories possible. But many more people began working in these large-scale factories around which cities formed. And then more factories and then bigger cities. And there's a massive movement of people from rural landscapes towards urban centers. And this fundamentally changes the way that life is lived in Europe and then the United States and then the rest of the world in subsequent decades following that as other places are modernized. And of course, architecture changes as we enter into this age. Something like the Brooklyn Bridge is a very modern piece of architecture. And we understand this as early modernism. It utilizes the newest and latest technologies that were available at the time. It's an engineering marvel from the point in which it was made. Of course, there's other bridges that kind of come close and that do similar things today. But from an engineering and from the idea of progress, the Brooklyn Bridge is a real marvel of its time. And it really marked a modern change in society in general, and in New York in particular. Think about the idea that you would, prior to 1883, you might have to hop on a ferry or charter a boat to get from Lower Manhattan to Brooklyn. This absolutely changed the dynamics of life for the region. And of course, modern art is really central to this consideration. And the word modernism really came into use through modern art. We looked at this painting before from Edward Manet, The Luncheon on the Grass, and I told you a little bit about what made it avant-garde, which is also sort of what makes it very modern. or again with Claude Monet, or even Vincent van Gogh, these sort of fleeting moments, even though this is a very sort of natural landscape scene, we have to understand that the passage through this space has now been altered for the artist and for all other viewers. This wouldn't be Vincent van Gogh's home or most Europeans' homes. This became an escape. This became someplace that existed in contrast to the urban centers where most people normally lived and worked. Now, there's also some fundamental changes in the way that we think and the way that we understand the world that come about as a result of modernism and which prompt further evolutions in modern thinking. Speaking of evolution, Charles Darwin is the first major thinker that really defines the modern age. As you should know, Darwin introduces, he wrote The Origin of Species. He introduces the theory of evolution. And this fundamentally changes humanity's view of the world. It had previously been an idea of a static, fixed notion of nature. And Darwin introduced this idea that nature was constantly evolving, constantly changing, that there was a progress towards something. And this notion of progress is really fundamental to the thinking of modernism. Karl Marx read Darwin, but was thinking about economics, and he was thinking about the growth of economies, and he was also thinking about the way that economies could collapse under capitalist systems. But he applies this theory of progress towards social structures, towards economic thinking, and he looks at the ways that economies expand and shrink, and he does that from a scientific perspective. These thinkers lead the way for philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche, who is often considered the sort of endpoint of modern philosophy, or at least a sort of high point of modern thinking in philosophy. Nietzsche very famously declared God is dead, which was shocking to many at the time and probably still is for many today. But this marks a fundamental shift in the way that humans think about the world, thinking about scientific ideas as a replacement for religions, thinking about the way that humans can continue to progress if unburdened by the traditions that had led to religions of the past and so forth. So again, it can be controversial, and in some ways it's meant to be inflammatory to some of its readers, but it's a very modern kind of philosophy. And Freud is the fourth name in modern thinking that I'll mention. And these are really the big four that most historians, many philosophers see as the key names that change the way we think in the modern world. And as you should know, Freud, along with a couple others, invented modern psychology, took on a scientific approach towards understanding the human brain, understanding the way that we interact with one another. Most of his theories are outdated now, and there's a lot of questions about how he worked, but it's a real sort of turning point in the way that we see ourselves in relationship to one another and the world. Moving into the 20th century and back to art, of course, the futurists relied on different kinds of mechanical representation. I mentioned this is a painting that wouldn't be possible without a camera. Or the suprematists did away with representational forms altogether. Now, again, you're probably noticing that I'm using the same images that I used when I spoke about avant-garde art movements, and that's very intentional. There's a sort of hierarchy here, and I wanted to address this. I know some people just talked about avant-garde art in their first paper, and that's fine, but we should recognize that modern art supersedes all different sorts of approaches in a way. But the quality of being avant-garde was considered very virtuous for modern art. We should always be progressing. We should always be thinking about the future. We should always be inventing new forms of art. So we have modernism as the overarching set of ideals and standards. And then we have avant-garde approaches to modern art. And then we have different movements within that. And we should recognize that the futurists, the suprematists and constructivists, the Dadaists, also the Impressionists, were all different movements that were all avant-garde. So just talking about the avant-garde is very vague, and it's not a very good descriptor for all of the different art movements that were part of modernism. Talking about Dadaism or Futurism or Impressionism is much more exact. And it's a point of clarification that I just wanted to make. It's something that I noticed. I've noticed this over time as well. And if you want to be a little bit more precise when talking about constructivism or futurism, talk about those things in particular, because they're really all avant-garde art movements, and they're all part of modern art. Moholy-Nagy and his machine aesthetic is a part of the Bauhaus. And the Bauhaus in general is really the peak of modernism. That's when we enter high modern art making, high modern design. And it sets the stage for the international movement that we've already looked at, for the Swiss style. It sets the stage for what's sometimes referred to as American modernism, which is what Paul Rand is working within, amongst many others, and Herbert Bayer becomes a part of that. But from the Bauhaus era to maybe like the mid-60s or 1970s, we have this era of high modernism. And that's what you might associate with the modern style. These sort of clean, minimal designs, very sort of crisp, angular edges, and so on. And of course, there's architecture that is always progressing, and different forms of avant-garde architecture as well, such as the Guggenheim Museum. This is a sort of innovation in architecture. There had never been a building like it, and there sort of still is not a building like it today. Both readings this week mention Le Corbusier. Paul Rand mentions Corbusier as a sort of benchmark for good design, largely because he's a great modernist. And Paul Rand specifically quotes Corbusier, who said, "To be modern is not a fashion, it is a state. It is necessary to understand history, and he who understands history knows how to find continuity between that which was, that which is, and that which will be." That is a great statement about the ethos of modernism. Know your history, understand everything that is and how it is, and always be looking towards that which will be. And Corbusier was absolutely thinking about that in terms of modern architecture and envisioning these new ideas for new cities, imagining a more convenient, full service way of life that would occur in this modern world. And yes, Paul Rand is a modern designer. And again, sort of this high modernism, arguably the end point of modernism, but this is absolutely the set of ideals that he's thinking about and relaying in the text that we read. This is a poster that Paul Rand made for Westinghouse, and it was actually a job posting looking for the graphic designers, industrial designers, interior designers to work for Westinghouse. And you can see he's deconstructed his own logo here, which actually is maybe like getting into postmodernism. I don't know. You'll find out in a minute. You can be the judge of that. But Paul Rand is absolutely a modernist designer, and maybe the last really great, truly modern designer. And we should think about how that's reflected in the text that we read for this week. But first, we also need to think about postmodernism, which is a movement that rose out of a response to modernism. The best and most confusing way to articulate this is from this table, which is printed in David Harvey's book, The Condition of Postmodernity. In the 1970s, mostly, there came this idea that modernism had ended, and that some architects and artists and designers had already been working in a style that was something different, which could be called postmodernism. Some ideas about postmodernism were articulated, and then more and more artists, designers, and architects attempted to create in this postmodern style, or in the sort of anti-style, as you might deduce from this. So remember, in modernism, and from the Bauhaus, we see things like the form follows the function. The second item on this list, form, is central to modernism, where postmodernism will strive for anti-form. Instead of the purpose associated with the form, it's going to be designed for playfulness. It doesn't necessarily have to have some grand statement. It doesn't have to be progressing towards a new future. It could just be playful. Rather than concentrating on the perfect masterpiece as the finished artwork, there's an emphasis on process, performance, happenings, the work in progress. I'm going to move, I'm just skipping through a few of these, thinking back to last week, the paradigm, the whole total structure of the world and of art making are important to modernism, where for the postmodernist, the syntagm is most important. Remember this, the paradigmatic and the syntagmatic? It's worth noting that Roland Barthes was a great inspiration for many postmodernists, and was quoted left and right in the 70s and 80s when these ideas were on everyone's minds. Postmodernism moves away from these grand narratives, this big idea about history, and starts moving towards anti-narratives. And you can see how this is important when it comes to ideas about who writes narratives. Up until the 1950s and 1960s, histories, and especially histories of Europe and the United States, were written from the perspective of white men, and there were many stories left out. So moving away from that grand narrative was an important step towards understanding and recognizing other voices. And so on. You can go down, you can pause the frame here and look at all the rest if you want. But I'm going to keep moving and give you some examples of postmodern art, design, and architecture. So the godfather of postmodernism, according to some, was William S. Burroughs. This is a collage by Burroughs, which makes a sort of nice image, but, well, nice as this image could be. But Burroughs was primarily a novelist, and in his most experimental phase, he would either type out pages or find existing pages from books and cut them in quarters and then just stick them back together. And whichever words came together, here was the writing. It's an extremely wild way to write a story, and it's extremely difficult to read because the sentences become nonsensical. But you have something like what Marshall McLuhan might call an effect, right? The whole book sort of washes over you, and you have this interesting experience reading the text. So that cut and paste approach became very important to postmodernism. Artists like Laurie Anderson moved away from making paintings and instead created these performances. In this one, we have spoken word, poetry, music, these light displays on the wall, a whole culmination of different media with different forms, which become this event instead of a painting that hangs on the wall. Or Cindy Sherman stuck more directly to the photographic medium, but her photographs combine diverse sets of images and create almost a cut and paste copy effect. This one, we see a woman crouching as if it might be a scene from a horror movie. At the same time, she's adopted the exact same format as a Playboy centerfold. The dimensions are exact. And yet again, and another to add another layer, she's actually using herself and making sort of these self-portraits, these images of herself for all of her work. So this kind of dark but playful, ironic reinterpretation of existing ideas is absolutely emblematic of the postmodern movement. And as far as artists associated with postmodernism, Cindy Sherman is one of the ones who is most referenced. Or in the realm of music, the band Devo took old songs and they played them in a sort of particularly bad kind of way. And actually began, their first songs were made for a film. They made short films which they wrote the music for, or covered existing songs for, before they were actually even a band. And then the costumes and the overall approach to their concerts and their videos was equally important to the music. Most of the early theorization of postmodernism skips over large swaths of culture. It focuses on established cultures that were already kind of entrenched by modernism, and overlooks different forms of creativity that were happening in different places. I think hip hop is one of the sort of postmodern genres that's really important and is often overlooked in the literature on the subject. Again, early groups like Grandmaster Flash would repurpose existing music, cutting and pasting songs via the turntable, and then reinvent new sounds based on these existing beats and oftentimes existing recordings. I think if you watch the video for The Message, and it's well worth your time to do so if you never have, it's actually a sort of documentary style video of New York in 1983. And you've got all these different layers of meaning piled on top of one another to make sort of a collage of what was happening in the city at the time. Or more specifically in the field of design, you have designers like Catherine McCoy who emerge and throw away all the rules that are associated with the style of American modernism and of the international typographic movement and everything that came from the Bauhaus onward. Catherine McCoy is not the only one. Wolfgang Weingart, the early work of Paula Scher, David Carson, and many more. But we see this kind of anti-style in design. We have many words on this poster that are illegible. We have what looks like a very accessible form, but as we move through it, we see that it's actually this kind of impenetrable collage. So Catherine McCoy is absolutely emblematic of a postmodern designer. It's playful, it's fun, it's using this kind of collage aesthetic to break from the norms of what good design was known to be. It moves against the sort of the progress that design had been striving for towards perfect communication and looks towards a different way of making things. And of course, there's postmodern architecture as well. The term postmodernism actually is derived from a writing on architecture. It's by a French philosopher named Francois Lyotard. And in this text, Lyotard says that you can look out onto a city, and when you do that in any modern city, we do not have one sort of continuous ideal of style, of form, of function. You actually see all different buildings made at all different times, many of which adopt different styles from different eras, sometimes revisiting the Baroque or the Grecian forms. And collectively, when we look at the entire city, we see this big hodgepodge of all different buildings that really don't match one another. And because of this, we have a kind of jumble of different ideas at play. And this is not the modern ideal that modern architects strove for. Instead, we should start thinking about that big jumble of the city and understand that we've entered a postmodern phase where the visions of the modernists did not come true, and we need to start thinking about something else, a new idea for what a city should be. This was absolutely a critique of architecture. This was, this was talking about all the problems with architecture, but architects and artists embraced it and said, yeah, let's do that. Let's, start thinking about new ways to create. And it became a style based on this negative critique. Oops, sorry, went backwards. And Robert Venturi had already been working in such a way when this idea had been articulated. So going back into the mid 1960s, this is a house that Venturi designed for his mother. And at first glance, it might sort of have all the normal kind of elements of a regular house, but notice that it's completely asymmetrical. The chimney sort of rises up in the center and follows that asymmetrical form. He's absolutely playing around with the style, using different elements from different eras of architecture to create something that is very playful to the point of being sort of borderline ridiculous if it wasn't also well balanced and really interesting, well designed house. So this is an example of postmodern architecture, and we should recognize that Robert Venturi, Denise Scott Brown, and Scott Isenor in the second text that we read are absolutely expressing ideas that will lead to the formation of postmodern thinking. And this text, Learning from Las Vegas, is a really influential text in the formation of postmodernism. So I'm going to turn more directly into those texts. First, I'll go back to the Paul Rand, and then we'll circle back around to Learning from Las Vegas. And just a few thoughts on each one. Early in the text, Paul Rand starts talking about this MoMA exhibition called Useful Objects for Under $10, which was staged in the mid-1940s. He recognizes in this exhibition that there's a movement in design where it's not about the ego of the designer. It's not about establishing yourself and your own personality, but it's about applying ideas to create functional objects that will be helpful to the users. And this is how he sees the role of all designers everywhere, and especially graphic designers. It doesn't have to be decadent. It doesn't have to be sort of, it doesn't have to be overly ornate. It should just be an expression of an idea, and it should be the most efficient expression of that idea. And Paul Rand really embraced this and saw the same thing at work in graphic design. He refers to these labels from the 1930s. And this is actually images from Paul Rand's collection of these balsam labels. Remember, he says when looking at this that the designer must have had a close relationship to the executives, that they had a unified vision for how the packaging for this cookie company would be displayed and how it would work, and together that would form a notion of what the identity of the company would be, and subsequently what the design would be. He sees this process, this collaboration between the designer and the company as a calling, as something that you do. He references, Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel, but he also says that you need to be ready for these ideas. You don't just do this as a 9-to-5 job. You do this every moment of your day. And if inspiration strikes you on the subway, you have to be ready to jot down these ideas. He also really embraced this notion of being surrounded by design. I think it's a really fascinating aspect of this article. This is another object from Paul Rand's personal collections. I've actually got the next few images I'll show you are from his own personal collection. And this is actually, all these images are gathered from an auction of some of his belongings after he passed away. So it's interesting as a kind of archaeological study to see what the things that he kept around him and the ways that he submerged himself in great design. Something as simple, this is like, a little pitcher for the creamer that you put into your coffee. I think it should give us, again, some inspiration to look at the way that a great designer can work, to understand this idea that one should be surrounded by great design, that one should be consuming and looking at and interacting with great design all the time, so that when inspiration does strike, when you go to make your own design, you're filled with all these different ideas and you're ready to act, and you're sort of living a life. He talks about the way that some executives go from the very modern office building back home, and it's a different scene entirely. He practiced what he preached. He sort of collected these things and had these things around him so that he was always in good design. These are some eye charts that he had in his collection. I think it's particularly notable when you see these big block serifed E's and F's, and you think about the IBM logo that he worked on for so long. You can see this relationship between the things around him and what he designed. There's many problems with his approach. The idea that every designer needs to work with the CEO of the company is questionable and maybe a little problematic by today's standards. The fact is, he was writing this late in life when he was the best known designer in the country, and he's kind of writing from a place of privilege. He had sort of established his career, and I think that the industry has changed quite a lot since then. And it had already started to change in the 80s when he wrote this. He's kind of looking back on his career at that point. So there's certain elements that we should be questioning in this text as well. Nevertheless, I think it gives us really interesting ideas. He also points to what bad design might look like, and he particularly calls out the Barcalounger, this chair. He says this is design gone amiss or something like that. He says that the Barcalounger may look beautiful, but it looks beautiful because it's comfortable. Really, at the end of the day, this is overly ornate. It is overly, there's flourishes that it does not need, and it's meant to create this sense of luxury more than actually providing a comfortable experience. This was not from his collection. This is not one of Paul Rand's items, but this is actually a chair that was in his personal collection. And it may not look like the most comfortable chair to start with, but if it's designed well, and some chairs along these lines actually are really quite comfortable, even though they may not look like it at first glance. So this idea that if you trust in the designer, you may find that the end product, even if it surprises you that it functions, when it does function, when it does work, then you have something that is symbiotic between the designer and the person for whom the thing is designed. I'm not going to share any more examples of Paul Rand's work. I think you should know what some of it looks like. And there's actually a great website. If you just type in Paul Rand, it's the first thing that comes up is his archives. And if you're not familiar with Paul Rand's work, you should absolutely look at more of it, because he is one of the most influential designers of the 20th century. And I hope that this reading is giving you some ideas about the ways that design can be a part of your life, and some of the ways in which you can embrace the calling to be a designer. And again, it's a very modern way of thinking. He sees corporations in the United States in the 1960s and 70s as tools for progress. And he's absolutely embracing that idea and becoming part of that. Whether we want to do that today or not is another question, but I think Paul Rand absolutely has some good ideas for what it means to be a great designer. Moving on to the second reading, I think it's interesting that both of them, towards the beginning, reference different exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art. In the Robert Venturi, Denise Scott Brown, Scott Isenor, Learning from Las Vegas, they talk about this exhibition called Architecture Without Architects. In this show, it's mostly photographic, and there is a kind of architectural element in the actual galleries, but it concentrates on all different forms of architecture that were made in sort of regions without big name architects, or most of them were made before these celebrity architects existed. They're buildings for whom we do not know who planned them. And the point is to study the sort of beauty and the planning that went into these structures, and to understand them from a perspective of architecture that the professional architect of today should be pulling ideas from. Venturi and the others think that this is a really kind of important touchstone exhibition for looking at architecture. The actual, if you read that little introduction, you would have learned that Learning from Las Vegas was written as a collaborative project for a graduate class of Yale students who took a field trip to Las Vegas. This was the idea for an architecture program, to go to Las Vegas, where there's basically mostly ugly architecture, and study it, right? To take some notes and to understand what's happening with architecture in the ordinary world. Instead of just going back to the textbooks and reading about the most famous architects, let's go back and understand the real world implications for architecture. In the beginning, they start, towards the beginning of this text, they begin by talking about some of the ways that architecture functions. And they speak of the piazzas in Italy, where you have this big social space. It's a pedestrian space where people move through at a walking speed and interact with one another. And there's a certain social dynamic at work here. This is a city center that does not exist in the United States, and particularly does not exist in places like Las Vegas. And it's largely because our cities are built in different ways. And cities become a sort of representation of the cultures from which they emerge. And this is part of the examination. How does the culture shape these different urban centers and the ways that we navigate that? The authors also point to structures like these Egyptian columns, which have ideas written directly on them. They're not just pretty buildings. They're also expressions of religious ideas, of histories, of all the sort of, all the understandings that one might have about the culture that they're in. Similarly, the medieval cathedrals in Europe do essentially the same thing. This is the Giotto Chapel that is mentioned in the article. You read this space as you move through it. You understand a story as you navigate the space. There's an interaction between image and surroundings. We could think back to a few previous readings and sort of reconsider what this means, going back to Marshall McLuhan and thinking about media, building as media. And we should also think about last week's, or the week before, whatever we read, Roland Barthes, and understand that this is something like the rhetoric of architecture. This is the idea that these authors are moving towards. What is architecture saying? What is the meaning behind the buildings that we construct for ourselves? They also mention the Mies van der Rohe's houses, his architecture. This is one called the Farnsworth House. And as they mention in the essay, there's no walls to hang artwork. You can't have paintings, you can't have family photographs in this house. The architecture seems to defy any kind of meaning, but they're arguing that there's a statement in the architecture itself, that the architecture claims to embody a modernist ideal, even if it's not clear, even if it's not written in the same way that the story of the cathedral is written. It's implied based on the architectural structures. You might say that the cathedral denotes the reason for its existence, the life of Jesus, where the Farnsworth House, the Mies van der Rohe modern architecture is purely connotational. It implies all the modernist values at work here. Now, this is all in stark contrast, or at least the last one is in stark contrast to the architecture of Las Vegas. This is actually an image that was made as part of the project. This is Robert Venturi looking out on the landscape of Las Vegas. And rather than looking at the great architects like Mies van der Rohe, these architects and these students went out equipped with pencils and papers, with cameras, and they studied the city. They drove up and down. They made photographs, they made films. They documented the ways that meaning, that text, that language and images interacted with the architecture in this city. And that's essentially what the article is about. They contrasted the parking lot to the French gardens, right? And said that you would move through and find your spot before entering the building. And now you do this in the A&P parking lot. You do this as you run into the grocery store. We're seeing a little snippet that's reprinted here. This was originally published as a large hardcover book, and then there's a sort of small paperback version that follows. But this examination works in the form of diagrams. It works in the form of all different approaches, both written and visual, to this landscape. Looking at the ways that the communicative aspects of the landscape, the heraldry, as it's said, the sort of the identification can be so huge, whereas the information is small and only accompanies that. They also worked with aerial photos and maps from above to do things to look at the overall language of the landscape. This is every sign on the Las Vegas Strip, all of the words that one encounters driving through this area. And similarly, we can look at diagrams of the buildings, the undeveloped land, the ceremonial spaces, which is the chapels, the drive-through chapels, right? And so on. And their point is to try to better understand the meaning of these buildings, not just the words that they express, not just the sort of, not just the direct messages, the denotational messages that we see, but to understand the cultural implications, to understand why these buildings operate the way they do. What does that say about our culture? How should an architect, a great architect, process this, turn this into something that will improve the sort of the buildings to follow? This leads into a funny comparison they make, or a funny kind of analogy. They talk about the ways that many buildings can be giant ducks or decorated sheds. And a giant duck is just that. They're thinking about, this is actually in Long Island, but it's a restaurant that is shaped like a duck. So the sign for the restaurant is actually the entire restaurant. Whereas a decorated shed is this small building, this donut shop, which is actually smaller than the sign. And the sign sits atop it, announcing the information to the world around it. I think the ideas in this essay are still very relevant, because we should understand that advertising and design and the ideas of our culture are now more in the landscape than ever before. as evidenced by Times Square, right? Now we have projected videos. We have, and actually this is a couple years old. Everything's different in Times Square since the time this picture was taken. We have this constant bombardment of information. And the city center is a little different from the way that Las Vegas is experienced, but we should ask ourselves, what are the messages that I'm encountering every day as I move through an urban space? What's the meaning of all of the buildings that I see in relationship to the words on them? I think there's very complicated, complex questions here. And I think it's an element of design that we don't think about often enough. So that's a little bit on those readings. There's certainly a lot more to think about. And again, for next week, we've got a couple more readings left, and this is one of them. It's from Stephen Heller. It's an article called The Underground Mainstream. So we move away from the sort of modern, postmodern dichotomy and look towards the underground versus the mainstream dichotomy. These are technically due at the end of this week, but I won't be, the reading, and there's a response for the reading in which you'll be asked to go back to your sort of 3-paragraph approach and also do a little bit of research. Start thinking about what you want to work on for your presentation. There's going to be more on that at the end of the second, my second talk. As you think about that, start researching it, and you're going to include citations in your post. So look at my post, look at the assignment, all the details are there. Let me know if you have any questions. It's technically due at the end of this week, and if you want to enjoy your spring break, get it done. But if you want to pace things out and do it, as long as it's done by the 24th, that's all you need to do. Okay, look out for the second presentation. I'm going to tell you more about some successful final presentations than that one. Okay, thanks.